You know what's strange? Most fears make sense. You're afraid of heights because you could fall. You're afraid of snakes because they can bite. You're afraid of the dark because you can't see what's coming. But then there's this one. The one people can barely explain: a sponge, a lotus pod, a beehive, a cluster of bubbles on your morning coffee. And suddenly inside you just screams no danger, no threat, just holes. And yet your skin crawls, your stomach turns, and you want to look away immediately. If that's you, you are not weird. You are not broken. But what is happening inside your brain is actually one of the most fascinating things scientists have discovered about human psychology in the last 20 years. Today, we're going deep into the psychology of trypophobia, the fear of holes, and by the end of this video, you're going to understand yourself in a way you never have before. Let's start with the basics. Trypophobia. Even the name sounds uncomfortable. It comes from the Greek word trypa, meaning hole or boring, and phobos, meaning fear. But here's what most people get completely wrong about it. Trypophobia is not officially listed as a phobia in the Clinical Psychology Diagnostic Manual. Not yet, and that has led a lot of people to say, it's not real, you're just being dramatic. But the research tells a completely different story. Studies show that somewhere between 15 and 17% of people experience some level of discomfort or revulsion when they look at clusters of holes or irregular patterns. That's roughly 1 in 6 people. So if you're sitting there with that sick feeling right now, you are far from alone. What scientists discovered is that this isn't really a simple fear. It's something much older, much deeper, and honestly, much more interesting than that. So where does this come from? Let's start with the theory that most researchers find the most convincing. In 2013, psychologists Jeff Cole and Arnold Wilkins at the University of Essex published a study that changed the conversation completely. They found that the images which trigger trypophobia, the clusters, the holes, the irregular patterns, share very specific visual properties with some of the most dangerous animals on the planet. Think about the blue-ringed octopus. Beautiful. Deadly. Its skin is covered in iridescent blue circles. Think about the deathstalker scorpion, the king cobra, the poison dart frog. All of them have patterns, clusters, repetitive markings. Your brain at some deep ancient level learned to recognize that pattern, and it learned to say, don't go near that. Here's the fascinating part. This isn't a conscious decision. You don't look at a lotus pod and think, oh, that reminds me of a dangerous animal. Your brain does this underneath your awareness in a fraction of a second, before you can even put words to it. Researchers call this an implicit threat detection system. Your visual cortex flags certain spatial frequencies and contrast patterns. That's the technical way of saying certain types of shapes arranged in certain ways, and it sends up a red alert. The feeling hits you before the thought does. Think about what that means. People who feel sick looking at a harmless sponge might literally be experiencing an evolutionary reflex that kept their ancestors alive. Your disgust is ancient. It is millions of years old, and it is running on autopilot. Now here's where it gets really interesting, because what most people experience with trypophobia isn't exactly fear, it's something else, something closer to disgust. And that difference matters more than you'd think. Classic phobias, like a fear of spiders or a fear of flying, produce a very specific response in your body. Your heart races, you want to run, you feel danger. That's your fight or flight system kicking in, driven by the amygdala, the alarm center of your brain. But trypophobia is different. Most people describe it as a crawling feeling, a deep skin discomfort, a nausea, an urge to look away, not run away. And when researchers have actually measured brain activity, they found that trypophobia activates the areas associated with disgust more than the areas associated with fear. Why does that matter? Because disgust has a completely different evolutionary job than fear. Fear keeps you away from predators. Disgust keeps you away from disease. Think about what clusters of holes can look like. Infected skin, parasitic infestations, rotting fruit, wounds that haven't healed. Your brain might be seeing these patterns and flagging them as potential sources of contamination. Not danger in the traditional sense, but biological danger, the kind that can spread, the kind that can kill quietly. Psychologist Val Curtis, who spent years studying the evolution of disgust, found that the things that repulse us most consistently, body fluids, rotting things, skin abnormalities, certain textures, are all connected to disease transmission. Disgust is your immune system's first line of defense. It's keeping you from touching, ingesting, or getting close to things that could infect you. So when a cluster of holes makes you feel sick, that's not weakness, that's your body doing its job. It just can't always tell the difference between a real threat and a coffee mug with a honeycomb design. Now let's talk about who experiences this more intensely, because the research here is fascinating and a little bit unexpected. Women report trypophobia at slightly higher rates than men. But, and this is important, researchers don't think it's because women are more sensitive. They think it might be because the biological threats that Disgust evolved to protect against historically affected women differently, particularly around pregnancy and infant care when immune function and contamination risk become even more critical. But here's what really stands out. People with anxiety disorders, particularly OCD and generalized anxiety, report significantly higher rates of trypophobic reactions. And scientists think they know why. Remember that implicit threat detection system we talked about earlier? In people with anxiety, that system is already running on a higher sensitivity setting. It's already scanning for danger, it's already primed to react. So when it encounters a trigger, even one that isn't actually dangerous, the response comes faster, hits harder, and lasts longer. Your brain has essentially turned up the volume on a system that was already pretty loud. There's also a connection to something called hypervigilance, a state where your nervous system is chronically alert. People who have experienced trauma or who live with chronic stress often develop this, and when your nervous system is stuck in a state of high alert, things that shouldn't bother you can suddenly feel overwhelming. So if you experience trypophobia intensely, your body isn't malfunctioning, it's actually doing too good a job. It's being too thorough, too vigilant. That's a different story than weakness. That's a system working overtime. Let's go even deeper, because there's a purely neurological explanation happening here that most people never hear about. Your brain doesn't actually see the world the way a camera does. A camera captures everything equally. Your brain doesn't. It compresses visual information, it looks for patterns, it groups things together, it takes shortcuts, and clusters of holes create a very specific type of visual input. They have what researchers call high spatial frequency contrast. That's a fancy way of saying that in a very small area, there's a lot of rapid change in light and dark, a lot of edges, a lot of transitions. Your visual cortex has to work harder to process that. And some research suggests that for people with trypophobia, this extra processing load produces an actual physical response. Not just psychological discomfort, but a kind of visual fatigue or strain that your brain interprets as something being wrong. Think about it this way. Your brain is like a computer. Most images are like normal files, easy to open, no problem, but cluster images are like corrupted files. They make the system work harder, they don't process smoothly, and your brain flags that difficulty as a warning signal. A 2017 study published in the journal Psychological Science found that people with trypophobia showed specific differences in how their brains responded to these images at a neural level. Differences that weren't present in people without the reaction. This wasn't just perception, this was measurable brain activity. Your brain is genuinely wired differently, not broken, differently. Here's something that will probably hit close to home. Trypophobia is getting talked about more. The internet is full of people sharing their stories. And there's a reason for that. And it's not just because social media exists. We are exposed to more visual information now than at any point in human history. Your brain processes thousands of images a day, and because we are online, we encounter images that our ancestors never would have seen. Images from all over the world. All kinds of textures, all kinds of patterns, all kinds of things that could trigger that ancient alarm system. There's also the nocebo effect to consider. That's the opposite of the placebo effect. If you believe something will hurt you or disturb you, it often does. Once you learn that cluster images are supposed to be disturbing, your brain becomes primed to be disturbed by them. The expectation itself creates part of the reaction. Researchers have actually shown that simply telling people a pattern is trypophobic makes them rate it as more uncomfortable. Even if the pattern wasn't triggering before, your brain is listening to the story you tell it, and then there's stress. Modern life keeps a lot of people in a state of low-level chronic stress, and a stressed nervous system is a more reactive nervous system. Things that wouldn't have bothered you 5 years ago suddenly get under your skin. That's not you getting weaker. That's your nervous system carrying too much load. In a world that never turns off, reactions like this are going to get louder because the system that produces them never gets a real chance to rest. Okay, so now you understand where it comes from, but what do you do with that? First, the most important thing is knowing that this is real. This is not in your head in the dismissive sense. It's in your brain in the scientific sense. That difference matters. You are not being dramatic. You are not seeking attention. You have a neurological response that is documented, studied, and understood. Second, if your trypophobia is mild, understanding it often reduces it. This is called cognitive reappraisal. When your brain understands that the trigger isn't actually dangerous, when you can look at a lotus pod and tell yourself, my ancient survival system is firing, but I am safe, the reaction can lose some of its power over time. It doesn't disappear overnight, but knowledge gives you a different relationship with the feeling. Instead of being overwhelmed by it, you can start to observe it. Third, if your trypophobia is severe, if it's affecting your daily life, if you're avoiding certain situations, if it's connected to anxiety or panic, then exposure therapy has the strongest evidence behind it. This is exactly what it sounds like. Gradual, controlled exposure to triggering images, starting with the mildest versions and slowly working up. Done with a professional, this rewires the brain's association between the stimulus and the threat response. It's not easy, but it works. The brain is plastic, it can learn new responses, it can update old ones. And fourth, and this is the one most people skip, look at your overall stress load. Because a nervous system that's been running on overdrive for too long is going to react more intensely to everything. Sleep, rest, nervous system regulation. These aren't luxury items for people with reactions like this, they're essential maintenance. Here's what I want you to take away from all of this. You are not weird, you are not broken, you are not weak. You are a human being with a nervous system that evolved over millions of years to keep your ancestors alive, and sometimes that system fires at a sponge. That's actually kind of remarkable when you think about it. The same brain that can look at a piece of abstract art and feel moved, that can hear a song and remember a moment from 15 years ago, that same brain is also running ancient survival software that hasn't been updated since before written language existed. You are carrying history inside your nervous system. The fears of people who came before you encoded into your biology because it kept them alive long enough to have children who eventually had you. Trypophobia isn't a flaw in the design. It's a feature that's misfiring in a world that moves faster than evolution can keep up with. And understanding that, really sitting with that, changes everything, because you're not fighting yourself anymore. You're finally starting to understand yourself. If this hits home for you, if it finally put words to something you've always felt but couldn't explain, hit subscribe. We break down the psychology of everyday human experiences in a way that most people never heard of.